I'm Alexis Schwerha with Campus Reform, and you're watching 5 Big Questions. Today, I am joined by Cherise Trump, Executive Director at Speech First. Speech First is an organization that fights for the First Amendment rights of college students all across the country through advocacy, litigation, and education. The First Amendment is a popular topic we hear about here at Campus Reform, especially when it's under attack to censor conservative voices. Cherise is here to tell us more. Cherise, thank you for joining me today.
Yes, thank you so much for having me.
So, what are some of the most prevalent speech code violations that you handle on college campuses?
Yeah, that's a great question because the trends have obviously changed over the years. I think some of the older ones that we've seen that are still relevant today because we still see issues of this on campus are, free speech zones or biased professors that grade based on their political bias. Clubs on campus, such as Turning Point, YAL, YAF, all of these clubs having difficulty getting club recognition through the student government associations or through the administration because they lean conservative, or the canceling of speakers, increasing security costs for clubs who want to host certain speakers, and of course your traditional flyering and chalking bans, where schools put restrictions on what students can chalk, what they can say in the chalking, what they can say on a flyer, or if they have to get prior approval. So those are the trends that we're used to seeing over like the last decade or so. But some of the newer trends that I'm seeing that are pretty disconcerting are, one is, selectively enforcing COVID mandates on conservative students, events or clubs. With the wake of the pandemic, bringing all the students back on campus, obviously schools have all these masking restrictions and different COVID mandates. But what I have noticed is that there has been a lot of incidents where schools have enforced specifically the mask mandates more aggressively at conservative events, but not at other events on campus. So this kind of starts to beg the question, are they using these new mandates to target conservative clubs or organizations on campus? Additionally, something that Speech First has done a lot of work on in our cases and litigation are bias response teams. This has been around for, the last 5 years or so on campuses that we've seen, but it has exponentially spread all over the country. Bias response teams are anonymous reporting systems on campus where students can report on one another, essentially tattle on each other for unwanted speech, unwanted jokes, or things they just got offended by. And schools keep records of what the reports are. Sometimes they call students in and, either mandate diversity training from it or ask them to explain themselves, even though they don't know who accused them. They don't know why they were accused initially until they come in for the meetings. And it can lead to real punitive measures, which is what we're seeing on some of our cases. So these are, in direct violation of the students' constitutional free speech rights. So obviously, this is something that we're very interested in. Some additional ones, I can keep going, obviously, are, computer network restrictions are some of the newer things also, especially on public universities where they're trying to limit what students can send via email, via their school emails, which again, this is direct violation of their rights. If you're a public school, you're a public institution, you cannot limit what students are emailing to one another. Whether it offends someone is a different question, but, putting a policy that leads to disciplinary action attached to that is a completely different, legal question. So also, something we've seen historically on campuses is Title IX issues with how due process goes about with campuses when a student is accused of harassment. And so this is something that after the Trump administration put some new policies in place on Title IX that made it much more clear and much more specific in definition, a lot of schools did not adopt the new policies. So this is something that we're seeing students are still being wrongfully accused. They're still having to go through bad processes on campus where, this stains their permanent record. So this is something we're also very interested in. One thing that I've seen that I find really bothersome is the increase in student government associations being very tyrannical. There has been a significant amount of viewpoint discrimination coming out of the student governments. They constantly try to pass policies that would discriminate against certain types of clubs, whether it be conservative clubs or Jewish clubs or anything, or Christian clubs, anything that can kind of go toward down the path of like woke progressive political interests. So that's something that I find concerning because it's much more difficult to hold student government associations legally accountable for violating student rights than it is to hold, the university system accountable. There's a legal path to go after the university system and administrators when they violate students' rights. Not so much as students, when students are violating each other's rights. So it's whether or not the school's going to step in is something I'd be curious to see in the future. Like I said, I can go on about this forever because there's all sorts of things that have been going on campus, and I'm happy to answer additional questions.
Now, I want to get back to something that you mentioned earlier, talking about bias response teams. Bias response teams are something we have been hearing more and more about here at Campus Reform. Can you tell us a little more about how this surveillance culture that's happening on campus is affecting the students?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question, and I'm glad you're going to focus on it. So this is something that I've talked to students all over campuses that have bias response teams, and they actively chill their speech because they know that they or their friends could be reported. I've seen schools go as far as accept reports that say, that are reporting on a student that was just standing in a group where something was said that was offensive to someone, and they didn't say anything. And the fact that they didn't say anything means that they also got reported. So it's getting to the point where students are just left and right reporting on each other, and you're creating a sense. And again, like you guys have always said, this doesn't stay on campus. This is going to carry over off campus into their adult lives, wherever they choose to work, or if they end up being put in charge of any kind of companies or organizations. The idea of reporting and censorship, it's going to create a personality, essentially a cult of personality in our society of never, or anything that you could do. People are watching people. It's like the thought police from Orwell. People are constantly like judging what you're saying, whether or not they can get you punished or get you in trouble for it. So this is something, especially with the rise of social media and everything that's been going on, and people expressing their political views on social media, the fact that people can now get reported to an administrative body specifically for saying something, or just putting like a frowny face on a comment, or and that the schools will keep permanent records of you on this, or go one step further and punish you and make you take diversity training. All of this is going to create an issue with like very, very compliant thinkers, right? There's the type of leaders we're going to get are either the one side, the students who like to report everyone else, which is going to be like these very tyrannical, kind of aggressive, weak-minded in a way, leaders, and they're going to be the ones that are in charge. Or you're going to get the compliant students who are just going to keep their mouths shut because they're afraid to get reported. They're not really going to step up for what they believe in. They're going to be very complacent, and it will create, in my opinion, like a sense of, like in our politics especially, but also in society, an entire group of people who aren't willing to take a position on something, and they're just like, oh, to each their own, and we're all moderates here. But it's like, at the end of the day, that's not what this country really stands for. So that is disconcerting to see the rise of students who are willing to kind of keep their heads down and censor themselves.
What should people who are not on college campuses know about speech codes and how they affect the culture of higher education?
Yeah, well, I think it's really important that people understand, like we said, what happens on campus does not stay on campus. I believe that universities are essentially the front line of what we have identified as this culture war, this culture shock in the United States. This is where ideas develop, right? For the most part, most of our research that influences and informs policymakers comes from the academy, comes from what's happening on campus. So everything that's being, all these research grants, they're all funding these universities, and everyone who's on the campus doing the research, they're also students or they're faculty members. So they are just as much being impacted and then impacting policymakers at the same time. So it's really important to understand that when you have this kind of like weakening of leadership, and you have all this self-censorship going on, how that's going to be reflected in the policy world, how it's going to be affected again in the medical world with like medical research or scientific research, because again, all of that comes from the academy. All of our industry leaders are going to pass through the university system at some point or another. So just keeping in mind, every single type of industry, most likely they have a 4-year degree. And until college is no longer a prerequisite to get a leadership position in a company or in any kind of field, then it's important that we pay attention to it. Yes, some people kind of talk a lot about like how we're getting to the point where we don't need We don't need college anymore to make money, and there's all these other alternative paths. But still, up to right now, it's still most likely people who are going to be in leadership positions are going to go through a four-year university system. So it's just important to recognize that they're all going to be influenced by this type of environment, whether we like it or not. So in saying that, yeah, we want to develop strong leaders. We want to develop leaders who have convictions, who are willing to stand up for what they believe, because that's the whole idea of being a leader, right? Being able to take risks is a huge part of being a leader. If you're a student who is afraid to speak up and you actively don't take any risks, and you've conditioned yourself, the campus environment has conditioned you to not take risks, what kind of leadership are we going to see in this country? You know, the entire founding of the country was a giant risk. Everything we stand for was a risk. So it's important that we recognize what could happen to this country and our future if we let this prevail.
At Campus Reform, we have covered many incidences of free speech being under attack on college campuses. Some notable examples include students at William and Lee University for being unable to pass out political flyers during the Virginia gubernatorial race, stickers at Emerson being investigated for offending students, and funding for Mike Pence that was currently being denied at Stanford University on alleged moral objections. Now, do you believe that these violations all occurred on an individual basis, or is there a trend that may be leading to some sort of institutional problem?
So I think it's the latter. I think it's a trend we're seeing develop as an institutional problem. And part of this has to do with weak administrators who are very, very, very afraid of the woke progressive mob. And even though that woke progressive mob is a minority of students, I mean, if you talk and you talk with students on campus, I'm sure you guys do all the time, you'll find that they're all pretty, most of them are reasonable, and most of them do want open discourse, and they do want open debate on campus, and they like the idea of challenging themselves with alternative ideas. But what you're not seeing is the administrators even taking note of that at all. The administrators, like the way that they operate is they just don't want to upset what usually is like the student government associations, as I mentioned. Those are the students that rise into power. The most outspoken, the most outgoing progressive students are the ones that are going to win the elections, the ones that are going to be in student government, the ones that are going to constantly be going to their deans and their presidents, expressing themselves and protesting on campus. And those are what the administrators are focused on satisfying, are those students. So like, as you always say, like the squeaky wheel gets the oil, right? So this is something that we try to encourage, conservative students and the majority of students, honestly, to start speaking up more. Again, the kind of complacency, when we see a report coming out of FIRE that says 80% of students self-censor at some point or another, that's really concerning, because, we need those 80% of students to speak up. We need them to like, again, take the risk to say something. Possibly they'll get lambasted on social media, or someone will try to remove them from their student senate position. But at the end of the day, we need more and more students to step up to the plate, because the administrators aren't going to listen. They're not going to change the policies on campus until they see that it is the majority of students, until they hear those students' voices start speaking up.
What should colleges be doing to encourage free speech on campus, and what resources do students have to preserve their rights?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. So in addition to like students standing up and like expressing their ideas on campus and making sure their administrators hear what they're saying and their faculty hear what they're saying, I think it's really important that students, one, understand what their legal rights are. Know your school's policies inside and out, and know when your school's policies or what your school is doing is in direct violation of your rights. Especially, and obviously there's a difference between private and public schools, right? So know the differences between those. If you're at a public university, keep in mind that is a public taxpayer funded institution. They cannot restrict like what flyers you hand out to people. They cannot restrict what you chalk, or like where you stand to like get a petition signed. They can't make those kinds of restrictions at public institutions. So again, students need to understand, one, you have two really strong avenues to be heard on campus. One is the legal route, which is what we do at Speech First. We actively defend students' free speech rights on campus by litigating on behalf of our members against bad policies on these campuses. In addition, there are other organizations out there that also file lawsuits on behalf of students. So just know who those people are. Reach out to me anytime, and I'm sure you'll provide my contact information and whatnot on our website and stuff, so you can find that at speechfirst.org. But additionally, there's also the other route, which is, target alumni and those who give money to the universities, because the funding is what drives everything they do. A lot of the times, if they know that their money is at stake, they will alter course very quickly. So talk to the alumni, reach out to your alumni associations, and see who's kind of running the gamut, all that. Make sure that they're aware of what's going on campus, so they can start putting pressure on the university administrators. But again, it really comes down to, again, taking these risks, standing up for what you believe in, making sure your voice is heard. Something that, I've been talking to some other folks in the academy about, it's like, we really need more conservative students to enter the STEM field, to get PhDs. I think a lot of folks are afraid these days, especially if you're conservative, to get a PhD and try to teach, because the environment's not friendly for conservative professors. At the end of the day, if we just kind of relinquish that field to the left, then we're never going to really make up for it. So it's important that students start to think about their futures and what role they want to play in all of this. And if they are interested in a PhD, they shouldn't let anything deter them from that. They should pursue it. But so again, reach out to me if you have any questions on the legal side. Happy to answer that as well. Thanks so much for having me.